My name is Akif Aydın. I'm the president of Theological Foundation. It's an honor to have you all here tonight. We are a little late, but it's raining, and it's very nice rain, by the way, because it's springtime. It washes up all the pollen. for the one who has allergy, especially like my wife, she's so happy. Okay, so tonight we have a distinguished speakers coming all the way from Chicago. Dr. Scott Alexander. He's going to talk about Turkey's democratization process and Gulen movement's contribution to it. And for the one that know about Turkey and especially about what's going on in Turkey most recently, it will be a very interesting topic and subject, and especially hearing from Dr. Alexander. So let me give a brief introduction about Dr. Alexander, and before it, I'll take to I know that most of you know about our foundation, what we do, but for the one are new to us, they are welcome to get a brochure flyer in downstate when they leave. They can learn about our foundation, about our programs, and also you can visit our website. But our foundation is, from the name you can say, it's all about dialogue, to create different programs, to bring people together like tonight, to facilitate around different subjects, to create an environment for dialogue. And for that purpose, we create programs for educational, humanitarian works, interfaith dialogue, all kind of things. So we try to be very active, and we are a statewide organization functioning in Clemson, Greenville, Spartanburg. It's recently, actually, it's not, we just did a couple programs out of Spartanburg. And Columbia and Charleston, very active programs going on there. In a couple announcements, we are going to have a Turkish, by the way, most of our members and founders are from Turkey. They are Turkish American. And so therefore, through our foundation, you see a lot of Turkish, entities or Turkish, programs. We do Turkish cooking classes. We offer Turkish language classes through our foundation. But it's again, it's about the dialogue. And on April 26th, we are going to have a Turkish food festival in Colombia. And somehow, if you will drive by down to the Colombia on Saturday, April 26th, there will be a Turkish food festival. And also on April 28th, we are going to have a Turkish musician coming here again at our foundation, this place. He will present about Turkish folk music, and also he will play. He's a musician, also academician. If you are interested in Turkish folk music, you want to listen to a musician, Turkish musician with the saz, traditional instrument, you are welcome to join that program too. You can get all this information on our website.
I'll have to come back, I'll do that.
Thank you. Okay, so let me just do my introduction for Dr. Alexander. So Scott Alexander's interest in Islam dates back to early 1980s, when he was both witnessing the events of Islamist revolution in Iran and concentrating in comparative religion as an undergraduate at Harvard. Scott went to the Columbia University in New York, where he earned the MA and PhD in the history of religions with a concentration in Islamic studies. From 86 to 90, Dr. Alexander taught courses on Islam and the history of religions at Columbia, Fordham, and Princeton University. And in 1991, he took a position on the Religious Studies faculty of Indiana University in Bloomington, where he taught as an assistant professor of Islamic Studies from 1993 to 2000. He is currently Associate Professor of Islam at Catholic Theological Union in Chicago, where he is also Director of the school's Catholic Muslim Studies program. Dr. Alexander is a regular consultant on Catholic-Muslim relations for the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops. And he sits on the editorial board of Journal of Islamic Law and Culture. He is also co-editor of Dictionary of Christian-Muslim Relations. And he is the author of a number of articles on Islamic history and religion and Christian-Muslim relations, published in scholarly journals, edited collections, and encyclopedia such as the Modern Middle East and the Encyclopedia of Quran. His most recent book project is entitled The Race to Goodness, an end to triumphalism in Christian-Muslim relations, and he deals with the inherent contradiction between religious claims to universal truth and religiously motivated desire to impose this truth on others as a means of political and cultural domination. In March of 2007, Dr. Alexander was one of the 5 United States scholars to be awarded an Association of Theological Schools Lilly Faculty Fellowship in support of his research and writing. Beyond his extensive work with the Muslim community in Chicago and the United States, Dr. Alexander also has first-hand experience with Muslim communities in the traditional Muslim world and is currently working to expand the outreach of Catholic Muslim Studies program to similar programs in Nigeria, the Middle East, and Southeast Asia. I know that he is also very familiar with the Turkish community in Chicago and in Turkey. So Dr. Alexander lives in the Hyde Park neighborhood of Chicago, where he and his wife Karen are members of the parish family of the Church of St. Thomas the Apostle. We'll take to welcome him tonight. Thank you so much, Dr.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you, Akifabi. Thank you very much. Thank you all for coming out this evening to hear this presentation of mine. I want to wish a blessed Holy Week to all those Christians who will be observing that special time before Easter this week. And I don't know if there are any Jewish sisters and brothers with us. This is Erev Pesach. It's the first night of Passover. So if there are no Jewish sisters and brothers with us, we can certainly keep them in our prayers as they celebrate this very special season. A few disclaimers. Don't you love it when speakers start with disclaimers, right? There are actually people in your midst here in Greenville, South Carolina. One is standing right in back, Dr. Kadir Yildirim, who are much more qualified to talk about Turkish democracy and especially the role that the Gülen movement or Hizmet, as it's sometimes known, has played and continues to play in the very interesting, especially of late, saga of the development of robust democratic society in Turkey. The first element of this title here, Islamic Renewal, is really what perhaps I can bring to the table in terms of my background as someone in Islamic studies, very interested in kind of some of the movements that have been around for the last 100 years in terms of trying to reform and renew societies according to Muslim values. But movements that, even though they've emerged in the last 100 years, are actually rooted in a dynamic that goes back to the very beginnings of Islamic history. So what I'm going to try to do is hit these 3 points, talk a little bit about this whole dynamic of Islamic renewal and reform, something that's really not understood very well because in the West, and particularly the US, because when we look our view or angle onto Islamic renewal in the modern period, particularly in our own time, is usually restricted simply to those manifestations of Islamic renewal movements that are very sensational, usually that have some kind of extremist component to them. And what I want to do is try to sort of open up our perspective onto Islamic renewal movements, talk about a broad spectrum of these movements that have existed in history, and particularly over the last 100 years, then locate the Gülen movement or Hizmet along that spectrum, and then conclude with some observations about the Gülen movement and Turkish democracy. And of course, this whole story of Turkish democracy is kind of an ongoing story, and it's often difficult to talk about ongoing stories because you're never sure what's changing as you're actually talking about it. So it's something we all have to sort of keep our eyes on, and certainly I have no crystal ball. I'm not trying to make any predictions, just some observations that probably you've heard before, but maybe I can offer in a way that would pique your interest. So let's go ahead. I just want to start with preliminary axiom that I understand to be stating the obvious. First of all, let me watch my time here. And that is that Islam is not a monolith. You know, one of the most misleading things we do in religious studies is give or buy into these singular nouns that we use as labels for the religions of the world, as they're sometimes called. Judaism, Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, right? They're all singular nouns. Why is it a problem? It's because the singularity of these names, of these traditions, masks stunning diversity, the stunning internal diversity of these traditions. Diversity over many centuries, so it's a historical diversity, but it's also a diachronic diversity, but it's also a synchronous diversity. If you take Judaism, for instance, you know, there are at least 5 major ways of expressing Jewish identity, 4 of which are specifically religious in terms of the practice of Judaism as a religious tradition, and one which is not even specifically religious, but still closely tied to those practices as an expression of peoplehood. You have, you know, Orthodox Judaism, Conservative Judaism, Reform Judaism, Reconstructionist Judaism, and secular Judaism. I mean, identification very strongly and deeply with the Jewish people, but not necessarily through any kind of religious observance. That's the diversity, and within each of those movements in Judaism, you have spectra, right? So within Orthodoxy, you have ultra-Orthodoxy, you have modern Orthodoxy, and things in between. That describes 15 million people. There are about 15 million Jews in the world. Move to Christianity with 2 billion, right? Move to Islam with 1.4 billion, and you can just imagine, you know, especially when you consider the cultural context in which you find these traditions, you can just imagine the kind of diversity we're talking about, right? So the same applies to Islam. No religious tradition is a monolith. Islam, like these others I've mentioned, is lived out in a variety of different cultural and historical expressions, many of which are accepted, but some of which are contested among different types of Muslims, right? And that's the normal sectarian dynamic that we find in the historical development of any tradition. There's a certain amount of diversity that can be tolerated in a coherent group, more or less, and then certain elements of that diversity can be considered to be going too far, and that means you're kind of outside of that group, and you have another group. So that's why you've got things like Protestant Christianity, and broadly speaking, and evangelical Christianity, and Orthodox Christianity, etc., and Sunni and Shiite Islam, and divisions within those realities. Okay, so let's after that sort of initial axiom is out of the way, or at least in our minds, probably better the latter than the former. Let's talk a little bit about Islamic renewal and reform. Let's sort of delve into what I'm calling here a brief historical perspective. The terms in Arabic for this are tajdid for renewal and islah for reform. Okay, so these are terms that have been that are deeply embedded within the tradition for a dynamic that is deeply embedded with within the tradition and goes back to the very beginning. The locus classicus, right, in Muslim scripture for this idea of renewal is found in what's sometimes called the Hadith al-Mujaddid. The Hadith refers to a very voluminous genre of Muslim sacred text that records the sayings and deeds of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and many of his close companions. The Quran, as many of you know, is believed by Muslims to be the verbatim revelation from God through the angel Gabriel to the Prophet Muhammad while he was alive over a 22-year period. But so much of Muslim interpretation of the Quran, understanding of how the Quran is to be applied in life, comes through the lens of the Sunnah of the Prophet, what he said and did. And so this Hadith literature is extremely important for deriving norms for life in the Muslim tradition. So the Hadith reads, "Indeed, God will send to this community at the beginning, Ras, the head, of every 100 years, one who will renew, yujaddidu is the word in Arabic, for its religion. So what the Prophet is saying is that, every 100 years or so, someone will arise. Now, whether this means just one person in the whole world, or maybe, every instantiation of the Muslim community in some way, there will be someone who will arise who will provide some special kind of set of gifts of vision and faith that will allow the community to renew its faith, renew the vigor of its faith, renew its commitment to its ideals and values. One of the earliest recognized and rare political figures to be acclaimed mujaddid was the pious Umayyad Caliph Umar ibn Abdul Aziz, who died right at the beginning of the 2nd century of the Hijrah, the 2nd Muslim century, the beginning of the 8th century of the Common Era. So you see that this idea of the mujaddid goes back pretty far in Muslim history, given that the Prophet himself dies in 622. So you've got someone identified as a mujaddid not about 100 years after the Prophet himself dies. No coincidence there, given the verbiage of the hadith. The dynamic of renewal and reform that gets reflected on subsequently in the tradition is one of adaptive continuity in change. Right? Continuity in change. In other words, as religious communities develop and evolve through the vicissitudes of history, entering into a variety of different contexts, the challenge is, how do we maintain continuity with that original moment of revelation when our Prophet was alive and giving us an example of how to live our lives and run our societies, given all the change now that's happened since then? And that change can happen in the same area, in Medina, or in the Hijaz in Western Central Arabia. But certainly that change will happen not only as you move chronologically out from the center, as it were, but also geographically out from the center, right? And into many different cultures with many different challenges, many different questions that are going to arise about how to live an authentically Muslim life. For most of Islamic history, the dynamic was indigenously stimulated. This dynamic of renewal and reform was indigenously stimulated. What I mean by that is it came from within the context of Muslim societies. The Abbasid Revolution is an example of this. It was a challenge to the Umayyad dynasty by new dynastic rivals, and a lot of the rhetoric of the revolution was very much tajdidi and islahi, that these Umayyad rulers were not really just rulers, they were not really caliphs, they were not really successors of the Prophet Muhammad, they were worldly kings and they had to be dethroned because they were essentially unjust, etc. The famous Sunni revival of the 11th century, the reform movements of Ahmad Sirhindi in the Indian subcontinent in the 16th and 17th century, and the movement of Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab in the 18th century in the Arabian Peninsula, from which we get the adjective Wahhabi, which is one that's often misunderstood and sensationalized a great deal, but we'll leave that for now. We'll come back to it a little later. More recently, and this is a very important point to realize, more recently, this dynamic of renewal and reform has been stimulated by the relatively exogenous forces of Western colonialism, imperialism, and secular modernity. You see the difference here? I'm trying to strike the difference between, sources arising from within Muslim societies and stimuli that are coming from outside, right? So some of you may be familiar with this history, others may not, but starting in the 17th century, you've got the beginning of about what unfolds to be a little more than 3 centuries of gradual Western European colonial domination of the Muslim world, such that 90+% of the Muslim world becomes dominated by Western colonial powers. The British, the French, the Dutch, the Italians, you almost name it, you got it, okay? So that obviously, colonial domination, in whatever form it comes, presents all sorts of gut-wrenching challenges for the societies and cultures that are being dominated. Right? Because this alien cultural force, stronger political entities suddenly now are running things, retooling your economy, etc. So all sorts of questions about, how we face this, how we recover from this, how do we maintain our own cultural integrity, how do we hold on to our faith, if along with Western colonialism are a bunch of missionaries that want to turn us into Christians. All those questions arise. Imperialism, of course, is not exactly colonial domination. You don't have the forces of another power actually in your society running things, but there are forces that are working on your society from outside, doing a lot of the same. Secular modernity, this is something that a lot of us take for granted, but it's something that's fairly new in the history of humanity, and it's actually, when you take it on a global scale, fairly strange. It's something that emerges in 17th century in Europe, partly because religion is causing more problems socially than it is addressing problems socially. People in Europe happen to be killing each other, ostensibly in the name of religion. It's because of a whole host of power struggles, but religion is playing a very important role as a leveraging tool in terms of the construction of oppositional identities in that historical context. So you get the development of the idea of the secular, a part of society that should be free from religious influence, and that comes along with the development in the West of modernity. Now, a lot of us, those of us who are people of faith, can perhaps understand to a certain degree the degree to which secular modernity does pose certain challenges to traditional faith. One is the market economy, where everything's about consumption and production, and so many of the deepest values of our faith traditions are about things that oftentimes, if we take them seriously, bump up against those ideals of market capitalism. So that's one thing I think we experience. However, in the West, we also have experienced a kind of positive legacy of sorts that goes with secular modernity, and that is especially secular forms of government, where it allows for pluralism to flourish. That's not always been easy. If you look at the history of the United States, it's not like, ever since it was founded in the late 18th century, we've just been one big happy family with all these different religions, and, there have been lots of struggles. But at the same time, many around the world look at the United States and say, wow, only in the United States. I mean, we had a moment in the history of our school where a Palestinian Muslim was receiving an honorary degree from our school, Catholic Theological Union, and we have our commencement ceremony in a synagogue, in a Reformed synagogue in Hyde Park. And he got up and he said, only in the United States can a Palestinian, Arab, Muslim American be getting an honorary degree from a Catholic school of theology in a synagogue. And that may actually be true, that only in the United States can that happen. So we benefited a lot from secular modernity. It's a mixed bag for us. What to realize, though, is that many of the non-Western societies in the world got secular modernity with colonialism and imperialism. And so they got a lot of the hard edge. They got the market capitalism, they got industrialization, they got all that, but they didn't get the freedom. They didn't get the democratic processes. Because the Western powers weren't really interested in exporting that part of secular modernity, since they were interested in controlling these parts of the world for their own economic and political aggrandizement. They weren't really interested in exporting these democratic values at the same time. So, challenges to these local societies that are experiencing these phenomena, Western colonialism, imperialism, and secular modernity. And so what you have is, beginning in the 19th century especially, some renewal and reform movements, which have been going on from the beginning of Islamic history, emerging in part in response to these challenges. Okay. So let's just look at the spectrum of contemporary renewal and reform. I've created a spectrum, and you could create any spectrum you want here. This is, I'm always telling my students to quote Jonathan Z. Smith, a famous essay of his, "Map is not territory," right? You look at your GPS and it shows you a map, or any Rand McNally map or Google Maps, right? You're not actually looking at the territory. It's only when you go to the satellite version that you're actually looking at the territory, and that's a photograph, it's not a map. When you go to the satellite version on Google Maps or Google Earth, then you're just looking at the Greenville area, and you see a bunch of trees and a bunch of buildings, and then you look for your house and you see your car and all that kind of stuff. But you don't necessarily know, where Greenville ends and another municipality begins, because you don't. There's only when you go to the hybrid, maybe you can get a little bit of both, right? So this is just this is an imaginal, not imaginary. I'm not kind of out in space when I'm doing this. I'm trying to root this in decent research, but it's a kind of imaginal understanding of how some of these things relate to one another, and therefore it's provisional. It's just one of many workable typologies. The boundaries between these categories that I'm going to be setting up for us are fluid, porous, and even multiply overlapping. So, and I'm going to try to go a little quickly through this typology. I mean, I could dwell and spend more time, and you'll see there will be text here on these slides that I'm kind of going to go through quickly, just so we can move along, get to Hizmet, and get to Turkey, and then have some time for questions and not put you to sleep. Let's start with neo-modernism. I got two pictures I could use many different pictures. This is Tariq Ramadan. This is Amina Wadud. Tariq Ramadan is a Swiss Muslim scholar who currently teaches at Oxford. Amina Wadud is an African-American Muslim scholar who recently retired from Virginia Commonwealth University. They're both prolific writers. They both published landmark works. Amina Wadud in Feminist Hermeneutics of the Quran, and Tariq Ramadan on many different subjects, but most recently a book called Radical Reform. See, reform, right? He's in this movement himself. They're both. Amina has also written a book called Inside the Gender Jihad, which is talking about the struggle for gender equality in various Muslim contexts and societies. So the neo-modernists, as I'm calling them, are inspired by classical Muslim scholarship. They're inspired by late 19th and early 20th century modernism. There is something called modernism, but that kind of died out, and this new movement is something rather distinctive, hence why I'm calling it neo-modernism. These folks are also influenced by postmodern, post-colonial philosophy and hermeneutics. They read a lot of what sort of Western scholars have had to say about decolonizing the mind, and how do we think about things like philosophical categories and analysis, and how they're rooted to structures of power in a post-colonial, post-Shoah, post-Holocaust world. They don't have, neo-modernists tend to be kind of influential, solitary intellectuals. There are no organized grassroots movements attached to them. And they also have a commitment to strong civic institutions. Progressive ideas oftentimes characterize these folks regarding religious liberty and pluralism, gender equity, democratic ideals, as well as a deep appreciation for secular institutions, certain secular institutions. And some examples of these folks are Farid Isaq, he's a South African, Tariq Ramadan, who's here, Amina Wadud, who's here, Khalid Abul Fadl, Abdul Karim Soroush, who's an Iranian philosopher. So that's one kind of place on the spectrum, right, on the spectrum that I'm proposing, and that's tentative. That's neo-modernists. Now we have what I'm calling neo-traditionalists, and those of you that recognize Fethullah Gülen, Hoj Effendi, see I've put him there along with Dr. Muhammad Tahir from Pakistan. The neo-traditionalists are inspired by classical Sunni scholarship. They are Sunnis themselves, Sunni Muslims themselves, and these two gentlemen, for instance, are deeply rooted in the best of classical scholarship throughout the medieval period and into the early modern period. They are also their individual spiritualities and their approach to interpreting the sources of Islam are very much influenced by traditional Sufi piety. Sufism is a broad term. The Arabic is tasawwuf, used to refer to a conglomeration of traditions of the development of the inner life. in Islam that take on very important institutional proportions. There are things like Sufi orders, international Sufi orders, etc. Sufism is a very important part of Muslim history, and it really does kind of transcend many different kinds of sectarian and cultural boundaries. The neo-traditionalists animate regionally centered global grassroots movements. Okay. And they are usually centered around, that's what makes them different from the neo-modernists. So around these figures, you've got lots of people that are gathered looking for inspiration. They're not just like with Tariq Ramadan and Amina Wadud, they're not just like reading books and saying, wow, these are some interesting ideas. They're kind of organizing themselves into groups of people who want to sort of connect with these figures and figure out how they can apply some of what these figures are talking about in terms of the development of their own spiritual life and of their own Muslim identity in modern society. They want to try to figure out how to do this. And so the grassroots movement centered around the pivotal charismatic figures. And there's commitment to civic institutions, religious liberty, traditional gender equity, a little different sometimes than our reformers. In other words, the difference would be that, sorry, not our reformers, they're our neo-modernists, they're all reformers. The neo-modernists might be a little more, might push the envelope a little more in terms of gender roles, for instance. With more neo-traditionalists, they're more willing to embrace traditional gender roles as long as there's a basic understanding that men and women are fundamentally equal and that they have equal dignity, and that some of none of the harsher edge of patriarchy that's oftentimes justified in terms of traditional gender norms can pass muster. A socially conservative democracy regulated by traditional Islamic values and morality. So they have a deep embrace of democratic ideals and values. They think Muslim society should be democratic, but more like a political party in any Western European country or in the United States that has conservative moral values. They want to see the democracy reflect the conservative moral values. So a little more Republican than Democrat, just to use those terms, which are kind of problematic in all sorts of ways to try to use to illuminate this material. But I think you get my drift. So some examples would be the Minhaj al-Quran movement of Muhammad Tahir al-Qadri. So that's Muhammad Tahir al-Qadri on top there, and then Hizmet, right? The movement that centers around or has its center of gravity in the charismatic figure of Fethullah Gülen. All right, so we did the neo-modernists, we did the neo-traditionalists. Now there's something I'm calling Puritan. I'm borrowing that term from Khalid Abu Fadl. You could call it Wahhabi, Salafi. It's hard to find the right terminology because there's a lot of talk about movements that fall into this category in the media, and when the mass media gets its hand on something and starts using terminology, it almost becomes useless to scholars who are trying to be precise and analytical and balanced, because the media oftentimes lapses into kind of highly politicized uses of the terminology that is used. So they are inspired by the Sunni reformism of Ibn Taymiyyah. He's an important 14th century figure, 13th and 14th century figure, via Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab, who was that reformer that we mentioned a few slides earlier. Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab, didn't have any axe to grind against the West in 18th century Arabia. He felt that there were elements that had crept into Islam, like veneration of saints and the pilgrimage to saints' shrines, for instance, which were completely un-Islamic, and he wanted to purge Islam of what he felt to be all of this bid'ah, all of this innovation that was destroying solid original Muslim piety. And there was an alliance eventually made between this particular reform movement and the House of Ibn Saud. And that alliance actually was effective with a little help from the British in the form of T.E. Lawrence and others in getting the Ottomans out of the Arabian Peninsula, so sort of wresting control of Arabia out of Ottoman hands and putting it into local Arab dynastic hands. And eventually you have the founding of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. So this particular brand of Islam that fueled this reform movement in 18th century Arabia actually has since then become a kind of a category of contemporary renewal and reform. And one of the reasons for that is that there was a little natural resource. Some of you may have heard about it. It's called oil. And it was discovered in large quantities in the Arabian Peninsula, which made the Saudi monarchy very, very wealthy. So their particular reform vision was something that they could progressively begin to export around the world. But it happened to be something very, very, it was rooted in a kind of stark cosmic dualism. You know, the true believers, right, who weren't just Muslims, it was a certain kind of Muslim. Because remember, Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab wasn't reacting against non-Muslims, he was reacting against Muslims who he felt had fallen away from the faith because their faith had been corrupted by all these innovative elements that have come in. So there was this very stark cosmic dualism at the center of this kind of reform movement. It was very particular to the Arabian Peninsula, but then it got exported through petrodollars in many interesting ways and has had some salutary but also some very negative effects on certain societies around the world. It's characterized by strict scriptural critique of innovations. It's especially critical of Sufism, which is that element of Islamic piety that I said was very important in forming the spirituality of the neo-traditionalists like Muhammad Tahir al-Qadri and Fethullah Gülen. It has a utopian vision of Muslim society based on an idealized memory of the community of the Salaf, hence Salafi. So Wahhabi comes from people who get called Wahhabis don't like to be called Wahhabis because Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab is an individual, and one of the things that was preached was no individual is important, it's just God who's important. And so they like to call themselves Salafis because Salaf means the pious ancestors. It refers to the companions of the Prophet, and they're saying we're practicing the Islam, the original Islam of the companions of the Prophet in Mecca and Medina. So they have an idealized memory of the Salaf, and they want to sort of resurrect that in contemporary society. It's the most widespread and well-funded of the global renewal phenomenon, with numerous elite government and grassroots institutions. And some of these examples are the Ikhwan al-Muslimun, founded by Hassan al-Banna in Egypt, and Sayyid Qutb, who was one of the most important intellectuals of the Ikhwan. He was executed by Nasser in 1965, I think. And the Jamaat Islami in South Asia, in what is today Pakistan, of Abu Allah al-Maududi. Okay, so these are examples of people who fall into that category. And finally, Shiite revolutionary, inspired by a novel interpretation and synthesis of traditional Shiite jurisprudence. I emphasize novel here because the Islamic Republic of Iran is not, as political commentators on television were saying back in around 1979, a medieval theocracy, a throwback. There's nothing throwback about the Islamic Republic of Iran, especially since it's Shiite. What I mean by that is Shiites never before the Islamic Republic of Iran thought that any rulers were legitimate other than the hidden imam. Now, I don't have enough time to go into who the hidden imam is. He's a messianic figure. And basically, from the perspective of Shiite theology, no ruler is actually legitimate except the coming Messiah. But the principle that underlies the current Islamic Republic of Iran is wilayat al-faqih, or the custodianship of the jurist. The idea is, in the absence of the imam, before the imam comes, the best person to run the government is a religious scholar, or the religious scholars. This is completely novel in the history of Shiism and in the history of Islam in general. that the religious scholars, the one who authoritatively interpret religious law, thank you so much, should be the leaders of the community. I mean, the political leaders should hold the reins of government. It's a completely novel idea. It's also inspired by traditional Shiite tropes of resistance against corrupt rule and oppression. Shiites have always been a minority, and they've always, Shiite rhetoric and theology and philosophy is always concerned with, the oppressed righteous who are trying to be the conscience of the not-so-righteous majority. Inspired by contemporary political ideologies of anti-imperialist resistance and liberation. I tend to be strongly anti-Zionist, for instance. And then some examples, the Islamic Republic of Iran. Khomeini founded it. His successor is there on top on the right, Ayatollah Khamenei. I know that can be a little confusing. So Ayatollah Khomeini founded the Islamic Republic of Iran. His successor as supreme religious leader is Khamenei. So it sounds a little similar. And then Lebanon's Hezbollah, which is currently led by Sheikh Hassan Nasrallah. All right, now we get to Turkey. Let's talk a little bit about the rise of nationalism in Turkey and the seeds of Islamic renewal. And then we'll get to Turkish democracy. In the late Ottoman period, basically I'm talking about the 16th to the 18th century, you have European powers gradually growing in dominance. They're exacting territorial and legal concessions from the Ottoman Empire. I mean, by the time you get to the 20th century, this culminates in, I'm probably getting ahead of myself, but it culminates in after World War I, the Ottomans had sided with the Germans, and so the price they have to pay afterwards is all the former Ottoman lands after the First World War, with the exception of the Anatolian heartland, which becomes the Turkish Republic, all go to the French and the British. And in the Middle East, particularly the French Mandate and the British Mandate, so all those borders and boundaries that are drawn in the Middle East, all these boundaries of countries like Lebanon and Syria and Jordan and Iraq, they were all drawn by the British and the French. Okay, not by the indigenous These were nation states that were imposed for the purposes of, continuing imperialist motivations on the local populations that had been part of the wider Ottoman Empire. Between 1839 and 1876, you have the Tanzimat reforms. This is when the Ottoman Empire is modernizing in ways and trying to modernize its military in certain aspects of its political structure in order to sort of compete with its primary rivals in the West. In the early 20th century, during the war period, you have the emergence of the CUP, the Committee for Union and Progress, and a brief period of what's known as Osmanlılık, or Ottoman nationalism, Ottomanism. There's a great book on this topic. It's called Ottoman Brothers by Michel Campos. And it's about Jews, Christians, and Muslims living in the late Ottoman period in Palestine. And it's about this small window of time when a kind of construction of Ottoman nationalism is being put forward as a way of uniting the various religious and ethnic elements within the Ottoman Empire all around a kind of common political and social identity. It's very interesting. You have the Allied victory in World War I, the Treaty of Sèvres, and in 1919 to 1922, you have the Turkish War for Independence, because the British and the French don't want to stop with, is that right? Yeah, the British and the French don't want to stop with the former lands outside the Anatolian Peninsula that like to have control of the Dardanelles and other things, and Turkey has to, the Turks have to fight for their Anatolian heartland. This is just a banner from this Ottoman nationalist period. Actually, the image is from Michel Campos's book. Ukhuwat in Arabic means brotherhood, or fraternité, right, from the French Revolution. In Turkish, uhuvet, right? Hürriyet, hurriya in Arabic, is freedom. That would be liberté, right? And Musavat would be basically egalite, equality, right? And so you can see this like construction. This is like a flag. This construction of Ottoman imperial nationalism, kind of incorporating, the Ottoman symbol of the crescent and the star, Ottoman Turkish writing still in the Arabic script, of course, with these ideals of the French Revolution. So really kind of hybridization of, traditional Ottoman identity and kind of modern French revolutionary ideals to create this new Ottoman nationalism. There's some images here that are to me a little bit evocative of, architecturally of this move, this development that's happening in the late Ottoman period. Going from Topkapı Palace, right, which is the traditional residence of the Ottoman sultans, and you can see the traditional Ottoman architecture with the domes and an occasional minaret and the interior of this building with the beautiful Iznik tiles, etc. And then the Dolmabahce Palace. So how many of you have been to Istanbul? So you probably visited both of these places, right? So with this is a much more European style palace, on the Bosporus, as the empire is attempting to modernize and become, a real kind of player and competitor with its European allies and adversaries. The pivotal figure in the development in these developments, which take it really across a threshold from Ottoman nationalism, like late imperial nationalism, to Turkish nationalism, to nation-state nationalism. In the founding of the Turkish Republic is Mustafa Kemal Atatürk. He saved the Turkish, not single-handedly, obviously, but he's one of the figures who is one of the heroes of saving the Turkish heartland from foreign invasion and occupation. He signed the Mubadele, or Population Exchange Agreement, in Lausanne in 1923 with the new Greek nation-state, and that was, all of the Christians. Therefore, Greeks who lived in Anatolia had to go to Greece. And all of the Muslims, i.e. Turks, I guess, I'm being purposely vague here because these are new categories that are being defined. These are new kind of ethnic nationalist categories that are being defined in this period. So all those Greek, so the Christians in Anatolia speak Turkish, they don't speak Greek, but they have to all go to Greece. And Muslims in Greece speak Greek, but they don't speak Turkish. They have to all go to Turkey now, because it's Greece for the Greeks, and Turkey for the Turks, and Bulgaria for the Bulgarians. And, this is very strange because all of these people didn't have national identities the previous week. I mean, that's an exaggeration, but to understand how kind of disorienting all this can be. And it's interesting, too, how Turk is defined, even. To be a Turk in the new republic that Atatürk is envisioning, you have to be a Muslim, but preferably non-practicing. Yes, because it's a secular republic. So you have to be a Muslim and preferably non-practicing. It gives you a sense of the odd ways in which we construct national identities. Atatürk abolished the caliphate in March of 1924. So I guess we just passed the date of that. We're in 2014. There's some even date here in March that we just passed. I can't do the math, but he closed the Sufi lodges basically because the tekkes were a connection with the rich religious heritage of the past. He established the azan, the call to prayer, in Turkish, which was completely counterintuitive. To take this call, which had been proclaimed from minarets and mosques for centuries and centuries in Arabic, according to the Sunnah of the Prophet Muhammad, and put it into Turkish. He replaced the traditional Ottoman Arabic script for the Turkish language with Roman script. Basically, it's a little bit of an exaggeration, but rendering a population illiterate overnight. You wake up one morning, imagine waking up one morning and all the street signs, it takes more than a night to do this, but all the street signs in Greenville are in Arabic. They're not in the Arabic language. They're in the Arabic alphabet. So it still says Greenville, okay, but it says it in an alphabet you're not familiar with at all. And you have to learn this new alphabet, and your children are going to learn this new alphabet for English. They're going to learn this new Arabic alphabet for English. And what are your children not going to be able to do? They're not going to be able to read any of the stuff that was written in the Roman script of English. It's going to look all foreign to them. If they see an inscription or if they see something, it's going to look alien and foreign. That's the whole point of this kind of social engineering of creating a new modern nation state in Turkey. And basically, he's embracing a kind of French version of secularism, laïcité, which is state freedom from religion, rather than the American secularism, which is more freedom of religion. It's a very big difference. Why in France, you know, a Muslim girl can't wear a headscarf in public school, but in the United States she can. Or a Christian wear a cross of a certain size in the United States, you can. I mean, why, when Merve Kavakci was elected to the parliament in Turkey from an Islamist party and she wore her headscarf in parliament, she was ejected, jailed, and charged with treason. But if she were elected to the Congress in the United States from your congressional district here in Greenville, I don't know how likely that would be, you can decide that, she would be able to wear her headscarf in Congress, almost certainly, we hope, but almost certainly. So as this Ottoman Empire is being kind of disassembled by the West, and this new Turkish nation state is being created according to the vision of Atatürk and the Kemalists, as they're called, named after him, a Western, secular, modern nation state, which is therefore trying to close the door on a lot of the religious traditional aspects of Turkish history. You still have the dynamic of renewal and reform going on. You can't stop this dynamic in any faith community, and certainly not in the Islamic society. It's been there from the very beginning, and it's always going to be operative in some way, as long as there are Muslims who are practicing their faith. So you have the development of two movements, the Nurcu movement and the Gülen movement, or more accurately, as I've been referring to it, Hizmet, or Gönüllülerin Hareketi, the volunteers movement. You know what, I shouldn't give short shrift, I'm worried about time, but let me just say, I'll put on all these things here about Bediüzzaman Said Nursi. Nursi was a traditionally trained religious scholar. He's called the wonder of the age, Bediüzzaman, because you know, he demonstrated extraordinary intellectual prowess and piety as a blooming Muslim scholar at a very young age, like we're talking about 12 and 13. But he also, because of his time, not only was he very steeped in traditional Muslim learning, but because of his broad intellect, he was also interested in Western philosophy and modern science. You know, he had a kind of, his kind of vision was how you know, people living in the Muslim world in general, not just Turks, he was a Kurd himself, could hold on to their traditional Muslim identity, to traditional Muslim values, to traditional religious practice, and at the same time embrace the modern world. Not easy when the predominant discourse was one or the other. Even in the West, we were saying that. And sociologists, not this early, but began to talk about secularization theory and how, you know, religion is just going to become, they were all proven wrong, by the way, Peter Berger's the first one to admit it, but how religion is going to gradually become in the West throughout the 20th century, moving into the 21st century, something that just people do in private and don't bring into the political and public sphere at all. Yeah, we see how right they were about that, right? So Nursi has this vision of being Muslim and being modern at the same time. And he became a strong advocate of democracy and therefore became a threat to the Kemalist regime in Turkey, because the only way the regime was able to enforce its very strong, intense program of social engineering was through more or less totalitarian means. And actually, when you think of what Atatürk's models were in the West, they weren't necessarily the bastions of democracy. I mean, they were more like, you know, Mussolini and those kinds of folks. They were kind of more fascist models about how you use the military to control an economy and create a state in the way you want it than they were modeled on some of the Western democracies. So he was a strong advocate of democracy. He was a strong opponent of communism. And around him, right, kind of coalesced the Nurju movement. Okay, people would read the Risale-e-Nur, his Quranic commentary, for inspiration. And a lot of this had to be done underground because he was eventually identified to be he spent many, many years in prison, actually, imprisoned by the Kemalists. He was understood to be a really destabilizing force in the social engineering of the Kemalist regime that was well underway. Fethullah Gülen is in a way an heir. He's self-identified in many ways, heir to the teachings of Sayyid Nursi, who died in the early 1960s. He's inspired by the Nurju movement, and he advocates a socio-spiritual approach to renewal, linking traditional personal, spiritual, and moral character and duty, ibadah, with family values and consequent social reform. This is not political Islam, which I'll have some reference to when I close in a few minutes, but rather primarily a social reform movement rooted in personal reform, rooted in personal spiritual growth and development, and the growth and development of the family, family values, and how a kind of transformation of society for the better is rooted in that kind of reform. That's kind of where you can also see the Sufi influence. So the Sufi focus is first and foremost on the individual person, his or her own interior life and commitment to the values of Islam, and less focused on trying to reform things from the top down. You try to reform things from the individual out, from the bottom up. He emphasizes service, or in Turkish, hizmet, hence one of the names of the movement, in the form of education. There are, as many of you know, 1,000 plus schools dedicated to quality math and science education for the purposes of giving young people who may not ordinarily have this an opportunity for a rich and fulfilling life, social justice and intercultural and interreligious dialogue. Here it is. Right? We're in a way, we're sitting in this room, I'm here, these lights are on, because of the teachings of Fethullah Gülen. That an important part of Islamic renewal and reform in the 20th century is reaching out to others, people who don't think like you, especially people of other faiths, because from Gülen's perspective, people of other faiths have a lot to bring to the table as we cooperate as Muslims, Christians, Jews, and others for a better world. Okay. One of the principal teachings, I would say, of Fethullah Gülen is hoşgörü. Unfortunately, and this isn't the job of a translator is never enviable. Okay, so the translators who translate the works of Hoca Efendi Fethullah Gülen into English want to find one word in English for the one word in Turkish. Sometimes that's really hard to do, right? Hoşgörü is generally translated as tolerance. So some of you may have seen, English translations of the speeches of Fethullah Gülen, the teachings of Fethullah Gülen, and you'll see a lot of talk about tolerance. And some of you may be saying, gee, I wish he would go a little farther than tolerance, because tolerance tends to have a kind of somewhat lukewarm valence. I'm just putting up with you, I'm just tolerating you. But that's not what the Turkish word actually means. It comes from two roots in Turkish, hoş, which means good, as in hoş geldiniz, welcome, good coming, it's good that you've come, right? And görmek, which means to see. Hoşgörü actually means seeing the goodness in others. Practice hoşgörü, Gülen says, so that your bosom becomes wide like the ocean. Become inspired with faith and love of human beings. Let there be no troubled souls to whom you do not offer a hand and about whom you remain unconcerned. He also says in another place that the reason why hoşgörü is incumbent upon human beings is because that's how God looks upon creation, and especially humanity. God looks upon us through the lens of hoşgörü. If God were to look at us and find our faults, God would find them in spades, right? And he'd probably be angry and wipe us all out. Go see the movie Noah. There you go. You can see. And but no, right? There's a famous hadith Qudsi. My mercy outweighs my wrath. God says, my mercy outweighs my. There's also a notion. I don't know if it's in a hadith or not, but I hear it frequently that if you need to choose on Judgment Day who you want to be your judge, your mother or God, choose God. So this is the idea here, okay? But it puts an obligation on us to look upon each other through the same lens that God uses to look at us. What does he have to say about democracy? A number of things. I've just chosen this selection. Democracy has developed over time. Just as it has gone through many different stages in the past, it will continue to evolve and improve in the future. He's a hopeful man. Along the way, it will be shaped into a more humane and just system, one based on righteousness and reality, or truth. If human beings are considered whole, without disregarding the spiritual dimension of their existence and their spiritual needs, and without forgetting that human life is not limited to this mortal life and that all people have a great craving for eternity, democracy could reach the peak of perfection and bring even more happiness to humanity. So what he's saying is, as long as we're materialists, right, our democratic ideals will never fully liberate us as human beings and allow us to live into our potential. He closes by saying Islamic principles of equality, tolerance, and justice can help it do just this. So you notice the language that Islam has a lot to offer the development of democracy. He's not saying other religious traditions don't have a lot to offer too. This is connected with his commitment to dialogue, but Islam has a lot to offer. So far be it from any Muslim, Gülen would say, to say that democracy and Islam are somehow not related. Because from his point of view, the ultimate vision of democracy, the essential vision of democracy, and the essential vision of human flourishing that's the core of Islamic teaching are one and the same. Okay. Hizmet and Turkish democracy. There's something called Neo-Ottomanism or Neo-Ottoman democracy, yani Osmanlıcılık, or Ottoman revivalism. These are two terms that are kicked around in some of the literature on contemporary Turkish democracy. These are highly contested terms. They're often used to describe the foreign policy of the Justice and Development Party, the AK party of the current Prime Minister Erdogan. Neo-Ottoman democracy is sometimes contrasted with Ottoman revivalism by those who wish to give it a positive valence. It's defined as drawing on the legacy of Ottoman pluralism in a way that is informed by and responsive to modern realities and concerns. Ottoman revivalism, which it looks like we're getting a little more of than Neo-Ottomanism at least has defined here, would take a lot more than just the commitment to pluralism from the Ottoman period. It might also take a certain authoritarian approach to rule. After all, even though in the Ottoman period there was a lot of consultation that went on in Topkapı Palace, in the end, whatever the Sultan said went. And I don't know, I don't want to make judgments about people I don't know and things I don't know, but Erdogan has been using language to talk about himself that really approximates the notion of the Sultan. The uncontested ruler. Who has the best interests of the people in mind. If you only leave things in his hands, everything will be fine. Not exactly a democratic ideal, but it seems to be where the AK party is going now under Erdogan's direction. There are natural questions about the future of Turkish democracy, similar in some ways to questions about the future of Russian democracy or of the democracy here in the United States. And that's what's all really up in the air right now. What about the role of Hizmet? Well, until recently, secular nationalist forces within the Turkish body politic have been arguing that the Hizmet movement is the Islamist, or conversely, Vatican or CIA-backed, Trojan horse in the AK party's program for increasing democratization and advancement of Turkey's role in geopolitics. In other words, up until recently, when Erdogan began to turn against the Hizmet movement, the detractors of Hizmet and of the AK party were saying that this Hizmet influence in AK was a kind of Trojan horse. It was an Islamist Trojan horse, or, in other words, once AK takes over, they're going to make an Islamic republic in Turkey the way you have it in Iran. Or conversely, Hizmet and Gülen are agents of the Vatican or the CIA, and they're designed to infiltrate, Turkish politics so that the Americans can control, or the Catholics can control, or both, whatever. These are conspiracy theories, so they're not always that well put together. Equally robust have been the media efforts of Hizmet and its supporters to counter the propaganda of its detractors. Here are a couple of images, by the way, there's Fethullah Gülen inside the head of Erdogan. I don't think anyone with the little American flag. I'm not sure anybody would put any stock in this anymore, right? Because Erdogan has turned against Gülen and Hizmet, and I don't know, his relationship to the United States is pretty ambivalent. On the one hand, he says, you know, Gülen is an agent of the CIA. On the other hand, he's calling Obama and saying, I had a good conversation with him, and it seems like he's going to agree to revoke Gülen's green card. So, you know, it doesn't seem very consistent there. And here, of course, you have the face of Fethullah Gülen on the body of a Pope standing in a mosque, you know. So again, the Trojan horse, you know, the infiltrator from within. As many of you know, of late, due in part to a growing corruption scandal in his administration, as well as, I would say, and others would say, his rising popularity in the Sunni Arab world, Erdogan has turned against his one-time allies in Hizmet. I would say that Erdogan has tacked toward political Islam. And I'll say a little bit about what I mean by that on the next slide and in conclusion. In his staunch effort to delegitimize Hizmet as a force for ongoing change and reform in Turkish society, Erdogan appears, from my perspective, to be following a retrograde trajectory of what Olivier Roy once famously described as the failure of political Islam. And what is political Islam? Attempts to secure power for an existing or new nationalist regime through a populist, conservative, and usually superficial appeal to Islamic symbols and ideals. Good example of this is, you know, the Taliban. You know, the Taliban don't talk a lot. Taliban rhetoric is not a lot about spirituality or reforming. It's about how long is your beard, how long are your pants. It's about creating a religious ideology, not reviving a religion, but creating a religious ideology to compete with other political ideologies for the sake of, you know, extending, you know, political control, in the case of the Taliban, over Afghanistan, and maybe over Pakistan as well. And Olivier Roy has a book called The Failure of Political Islam, in which he talks about how many of these movements, which are just various kinds of ideologies, a lot of them otherwise Western ideologies, in Islamic dress, have ultimately failed to bring to the societies that which they hold as promise for the societies they've been at work in. The opposite of political Islam in the Turkish context is what has been called civil Islam. Sometimes this new Turkish version of political Islam is called Kemalo Islam. Kemal referring to the Kemalist regime, right? That held sway really before the ascendancy of the AKP. And it held sway through a very authoritarian approach to government, which wasn't very democratic. Very nationalist, right? So the question is, if you have a nationalist authoritarian version of Islamic politics in Turkey, it's basically Kemalo Islam, which for many people up until recently would have been an oxymoron, because Kemalism was so opposed to religion and anything Islamic. So the Islam of the Hizmet movement has been categorized aptly, I think, by Ihsan Yilmaz and others as civil Islam, not political Islam, because of its deep commitment to the flourishing of civic institutions and democratic processes independent of allegiance to a particular political party. Doesn't mean that the people of Hizmet aren't politically engaged. They're very much politically engaged, but not supporting one particular party or the other based on the identity of that party and the people who populate that party. For a long time, members of Hizmet were in support of the AK party because of the harmony of ideals and values between what AK seemed to espouse, the democratic values they seemed to espouse, and the democratic values that were being lifted up in the teachings of Fethullah Gülen. But now that those democratic values aren't as front and center, and democratic processes like judicial investigations are not being carried through, you know, Hizmet has withdrawn its support functionally from the AK party, and that's part of what has angered Erdogan. It's no coincidence then that Erdogan's frontal assault on Hizmet, rooted in the ideology of what some have dubbed Kemal Islam, has been accompanied by a crackdown on social media, Twitter, which is like saying Twitter Schmitter. When he shut down Twitter, he said Twitter Schmitter, you know, in Turkish, and alleged interference in the recent electoral process. I don't know, but over 40 cities in Turkey experienced a blackout on the day of the election, the recent election. And the Minister of Energy said it was because a cat got into the grid. And this is a little kind of meme where he's saying, Emri ben verdim, I ordered it. I ordered the electric shutdown. You know, you can't believe, go Google cat Turkish elections and you'll get all these memes that people have created. They're really hilarious, you know. So it's getting to the point of surreal that the Minister of Energy actually said, the AK party said actually a cat got into the electrical grid and that was the reason why the power went out in over 40 cities on the day of the elections. So the story goes on, but that's where I end. Thank you very much.
You know, in that short moment, to giving all the historical perspective of Islam, different movements in the history of Islam, and especially coming to modern Turkey and Turkish democracy, it was a great presentation. Thank you so much once again.
Astaghfirullah, thank you.
So now it's turning to your questions. Yes.
Or comments, or
comments. Right.
Yeah.
So I know that some of the terms might be new to you, and some of you have been closely following what's going on in Turkey, or some of you are really new. But any questions for the terminology or anything going on in Turkey?
And not just to me, there are people who know much more about this. I should have started with this little story about this guy who survived. I'll give you the Reader's Digest. He survived the great Johnstown flood in Pennsylvania, the early 20th century, and would tell everybody constantly about his stories of survival. And he's on his deathbed, and his pastor comes in and he says, "Pastor, do you have any advice for me?" And he says, "Well, I assume, Bill, that when you enter the pearly gates, you're going to want to tell everybody in paradise your stories about how you survived the great Johnstown flood." And he said, "Well, yeah, of course, one of the first things I want to do." He said, "Okay, just remember one thing when you get there. Noah will be in the audience." So there are a lot of Noahs here, for me, for my Bill. So as long as we know that.
Well, just I've understood from some reading that the Hizmet movement has a lot of people who follow it in the police force and in the judiciary and things like that, which I find sort of interesting from an American perspective. You don't think of a movement like that having a big representation in the professional strata. How did that come about?
Yeah, you know what? I have to kind of profess, I've heard that statistic, and it's probably to a certain degree true, but it's also true that if you go to the business class in Turkey too, there's a large percentage of entrepreneurs in Turkey who are also closely affiliated with the Hizmet movement in one way or another. Educators who are also, so I think what they're focusing on is the fact that what Erdogan did was he accused these particular professions of being unduly influenced by the Hizmet movement. Why? Because he was going to be under investigation, and the ones that would carry out this investigation would be the judiciary and the police force. So if you want to suggest that there's and this argument is very powerful in Turkey because of the history, foreign influence, right? The foreigners who are trying to take our country away from us. That's a very powerful narrative in Turkey. So that's what Erdogan's tapping into. Where does Gülen live? Pennsylvania. Look at the police and the judges that want to come down on me and suggest that all this money I've just been collecting for poor people is some kind of embezzlement, right? They're all part of Hizmet. 2 and 2 together, and you get 8. That's basically his calculus, but I think that's why we've heard so much about the preponderance. I think that you have a lot of people in one way or another affiliated with the Hizmet movement in a variety of different sectors of Turkish. Journalists, I mean, so many newspapers and journalists are also, affiliated with the Hizmet movements.
It does sound like there's a lot of professional people of all varieties involved.
Right,
How
right.
far does it extend into the less professional classes, whatever the right?
That's beyond that's for a sociologist, and I really have no idea. I can tell you that this is just anecdotal, so this is not evidence of any kind other than anecdotal evidence. But, when I've been in Turkey myself and I've had a chance to mingle just with people outside explicitly Hizmet circles, right? Oftentimes when I go to Turkey, I'm with Hizmet sisters and brothers and all that. And of course, everybody knows what Hizmet is, you know. And there's astonishing variety of people who are positively oriented. Now, I haven't been there recently. And obviously, what Erdogan is trying to do is change the hearts and minds of some people that may have been on the fence. And I suspect that's a lot of people, right? Like in the United States, right? The swing vote, right? I expect that's... So there's always been a core of folks that have been that have admired deeply Fethullah Gülen and Hizmet, people part of the movement itself, you know, on one end of the political spectrum. Then they're ardent opponents, you know, both Islamist, really, and secularist on the other end. And I think you get a vast middle ground, like in any body politic, you know, that's kind of like, nah, they do some good things, they do some bad things. I kind of like them, I kind of don't like them. There are lots of stories of people in Hizmet who come from families who are not Hizmet families. And their families could be split down the middle, even mother and father, difference about whether they really approve of you being affiliated with Hizmet or not. So a lot of people on the fence, and I think that's the battle that Erdogan has declared. He wants to get those fence people on his side.
Looking at the political map of the most recent local elections over there, it appeared that there was a pretty dramatic split with the areas that are not so well developed or not so economically privileged going pretty strongly for the prime minister. Is that,
he has, you know, the thing is, Erdogan has this, get back to the narrative of foreign influence. I mean, there's also, you know, Erdogan has this appeal of the strong leader, you know. So, you know, if you're not really used to, if you're not that educated, right, then chances are you might not, I'm just shooting from the hip here, right? Chances are you might not be, you know, as familiar with how important democratic processes might be, despite what might be some of the ineptitude. I mean, look at trying to get some things done in this democracy. It's very hard, right? Because democracy, what did Churchill say? It's the worst form of government except for all the others, right? That's what Churchill said about democracy, right? So, I mean, there's, in a lot of parts of the world, there's deep admiration for the strong leader. And Erdogan has been at the helm of AK, you know, during, this is changing right now in ways, but during an incredible economic revival in Turkey, or a credible economic development. You know, roads being built and new airports being built and more jobs and development, you know, so, and even agriculture strengthened in various ways. And then also him standing up to, you know, powerful global leaders that normally, you know, a leader of Turkey might not stand up to. For instance, the Israelis, you know. Standing up to the Israelis and, you know, walking out of a meeting with the Israeli foreign minister or something like that, or his very strong approach to Assad in Syria. You know, that this is, you know, Assad's a Shiite and a despot, and I'm a Sunni Democrat, and in the name of Sunni Islam, we're going to, so all of this, it's populism. You know, and all of this populism rooted in strength and power, and I'm going to protect you, goes a long way for human beings in general, and particularly for those who might not have the education to sort of deconstruct it and say, what's behind, I don't really look like what's behind that. That makes me kind of nervous, you know. So I would think that that's one of the reasons why you have that kind of, that split.
I worked overseas a number of years in Islamic countries, and I came to the conclusion, and continue to believe, that a strong leader is associated generally with an Islamic country. Think of all that we have. Egypt, for example, at this moment, and before, even Iran, and now got a strong leader, even though it's sort of democratic. The Shah was a very strong leader in those days, and I keep thinking all the way through, and now you're telling me about Turkey.
Yeah, but I wouldn't, here's where I would maybe just want to throw something else in here, that it's not so much Islam as it is, what word are we going to use? You know, people, cultures that have in some way, you know, outside the West, I don't like describing cultures as outside the West, but I mean, for instance, China is the same way. So I might as well just give examples rather than, huh?
And Russia.
Yeah, exactly. Putin, so a lot of non-Western society, because it's, and we have that propensity in the West. When we go to the polls, what are we looking for? I remember when Gore and Bush were running against each other, and I knew who was going to win. Even though it was so really close, I said, oh, it looks like Bush is going to win, because they did a focus study of males between the ages of like 30 and 50 or something like that. And they asked him, if Gore were a car, what kind of car would he be? And they said a Ford Taurus. And I said, if Bush were a car, what kind of car would he be? A Corvette. I knew right there. And then the whole idea that Bush is the kind of guy you can have a beer with. That whole idea that, a salt of the earth, that charisma of the personality, the strong leader, even in what we like to think is a flourishing democracy like our own, could you really elect a squat, stout, bald man who was the most brilliant political mind, and great moral leader in the country to be president of the United States? I doubt it. No chance.
Get more votes than Bush.
Say what? Well, yeah, maybe.
We were in Turkey a year ago, and I agree that what we saw then when we interacted with his men was trying to win the swing vote.
Mm-hmm.
Will the movement survive when Gulen's no longer with us?
That's a great question. Of course, the answer is Wallahu a'lam, right? This is a standard Muslim answer, which even though I'm not a Muslim, God knows better, right? How could I possibly know, right? Having said that, I think the answer is yes, because the movement is so much more than its center inspiration. When you look at the movement in the United States, I would agree with those who would say, I'm one of the people who says this, that you wouldn't have the robustness of Hizmet in the United States were it not for the fact that Gülen were here. But all that Hizmet has accomplished in the United States in terms of organizations like the South Carolina Dialogue Foundation, Turkish Cultural Centers, the Niagara Foundation, where I am, so many of the charter schools, are a legacy that has its own inherent value, both for the people who are part of the movement and who have made the United States their home, right, as well as for the larger society in many ways. So I don't see, there may be some changes. I think what's going to happen is there will be a change in the current authority structure in the movement. The movement from my perspective is both decentralized and centralized at the same time. So there's a lot of decentralizing local kind of initiatives and authority, but you've got one man who's really looked at as, perhaps the greatest religious leader of his age by the people in Hizmet. So the folks around that one man who associate regularly with him are obviously going to have more weight and more authority. Now, when God calls him, right, will that role be filled? I doubt it. What will happen is probably like any community, it's going to experience some problems and trouble. I like to think that if his legacy and the values he taught really mean as much as they appear to do to so many people in Hizmet, that it will certainly survive. One of the reasons, why Gülen doesn't like the phrase Gülen movement, although I think a lot of people in academia like it because it's expressive of something you can put your hand on. Like, if you want to know what the ideals and values of the movements are, you can look up Fethullah Gülen and his writings and his life story, and it gives you information. But he loathes the name because it goes against the fiber of his being. This is not about me. It's about God, it's about service. He's always trying to point outside of himself, But human beings are like that. They are, when the Prophet Muhammad died, it's very famous, the Prophet Muhammad died, his close companion Umar ibn al-Khattab said, the Prophet's not dead. Can't die. And Abu Bakr, his other companion, said, the Prophet's dead, but God is alive. And we as Muslims, as much as we love the Prophet and respected the Prophet and want to follow his example, our Islam doesn't depend ultimately on the Prophet being alive for us. It depends on the fact that God is alive and we have this relationship with God. So I think there'll be some changes, there'll be some difficult periods, but I think the movement will definitely survive.
Yeah. You very skillfully breezed over the Armenian genocide.
I didn't breeze over it, I didn't even touch it, yeah.
That was probably a smart thing given some of the room. Did you see any hope that someday the Turkish people may accept the reality of that? And do you think maybe that's the origin of the whole movement of conspiracy theories that flow out of Turkey in endless numbers over any topic?
Well, that's a great point. So here's what I think. The Armenian genocide, if we call it that, it's just like, it's one of these things, even the word, right? So when you go to Israel and Palestine, is it the security fence, the apartheid wall, whatever you call it, tells something about your politics, right? So the term, the event and the memory of the event, of course, historical reality, the memory of the event and the terms used to refer to the event are highly politicized. So the discourse around the event is not actually moral discourse. It's, in my opinion, it's largely political discourse. I believe once the politicization of the event and the memory of the event can be put in perspective, or its significance wanes, people can actually then face the moral implications and name, whatever word they choose to use, name that horrific tragedy that happened. I think the problem is that as soon as someone's raising the specter of that event, they're perceived, may not be true, they're perceived to have a political agenda. So they're using the event for political purposes, not to teach an important moral truth. So many have considered the talk of the Armenian genocide to be a way of delegitimizing the Turkish state and Turkish. Now it plays into that whole foreign powers trying to undo Turkey, right? And so then they resist that, but in resisting it completely, you're actually turning a blind eye to a moral tragedy of enormous proportions. And so what is your soul as a nation like when you do that? I'll say, though, we don't talk about, I don't hear, there's no laws against it in this country, so it doesn't have that element to it. But I don't hear any talk of the Native American genocide. Widespread. This country itself that we inhabit was founded on genocide and chattel slavery, two of the greatest sins that humanity can commit. Okay? It hasn't been just committed by people in North America, but those are two pivotal events in the history, and they don't make it into any mainstream narrative of U.S. American identity. Yet we want to point the finger at the Turks and say, you don't want to talk about the Armenian genocide. So what's going on there? See? If it's all moral discourse, let's get moral. All the way around, let's get moral. And I would be very comfortable if we did that. But unfortunately, it's largely political discourse for different political agendas. And that's really unfortunate.
Questions?
Thank you so much. Thank you very much. Thank you.
It's time to taste some Turkish food.
Ooh, nice. Is it democratic food or?
Yes.
Okay, it's democratic food.
So, also you have a chance to talk with Dr. Alexander. Thank you so much for coming here tonight.